It's on, right?
Wonderful. It is on. Have a wonderful session.
Thank you. Thank you, Alina. Welcome all. My name is Anuban Kate. I'm based here in Paris, and we have today the fourth day of the EU-India People Summit, which we call as a celebration of ideas. Since last 3 days now, we had very interesting sessions, and during this entire week until 8th of May, we have different topics, themes, human rights, business and trade, the feminist movements, and a lot more that you can check on our websites. Today, we have a session that's human rights, and Ravi Nair will be taking us forward along with his guest. And I just a small announcement to the participants. If you have questions, please add those into the Q&A session. And I wish you a nice session. Ravi, please take it forward.
Thank you, Anuban. I have great pleasure in moderating this particular session on human rights. We have a very distinguished panel, Mr. Anand Grover, a senior advocate in the Supreme Court of India, who has been one of the pillars of human rights in the courts across India, both the High Courts and the Supreme Court, and in fact comes to this session straight from the High Court, where he's been on his legs dealing with the detainees in the Bhima Koregaon case. The second panelist and speaker will be Kavita Srivastava, who is the General Secretary of the largest civil liberties organization in India, the People's Union for Civil Liberties. She's done brilliant work, not just in Jaipur, Rajasthan, where she stays, but across India. And she's been in the forefront of a number of campaigns launched by PUCL as well as by other organizations in the defense of human rights defenders. Thank you, Kavita. Professor Balcerowicz is from Warsaw in Poland. He's a well-known Indologist, and we connected some years ago on his work also on human rights, in particular in conflict areas in India. He's been writing about this, thinking about this, contacting groups in Europe and India about this. So I'm sure he'll tell us about it because he's quite well informed on the subject, sitting quite far away from
Ravi, you have to unmute it. I think you went on mute.
So it's one of the better Indology departments in Europe and across the world. Without further ado, I will quickly launch into the introduction of the meeting itself. As it is, I'll say a few words only on the EU issues and leave the India issues or any other EU issues that you would like to raise. I will not, in this initial presentation, raise any EU issues. I must congratulate the organizers for having put together this whole session from the 1st to the 8th, and also including this panel on human rights. More so as both the European Commission, the nomenclatura of the European establishment, and the European Parliament have been very, let's say, laggardly as far as human rights concerns in India have been. In fact, in the Commission forgot to hold its human rights dialogue, or was unable to hold its human rights dialogue for last 7 years, and only held one earlier this year. The joint press release issued by them and the government of India was as weak can be. I shan't say further at this stage. In January 2020, the European Parliament introduced a resolution on the discriminatory nature of citizenship laws in India. Uh, Under immense external pressure, both from India as well as from the European Commission, they never brought it to a vote. Early this year, they finally put together a small resolution which says nothing really. The It is clear that there needs to be greater action on the part of EU civil society to get Indian human rights on the agenda. And this effort will be part of that process. Thank you. With these initial introductory remarks, I have great pleasure in inviting Anand Grover, Senior Advocate of the Supreme Court of India, to make his presentation. It's about 15 minutes. You can at the max go to 20 because we have to conclude at 5:30 p.m. sharp. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ravi, for those commendations. I just want to congratulate the European Union offices and the persons who are organizing the meeting, Anuban, Piotr, and my colleague Kavita for being here with me. I want to just make a few opening remarks.
It seems that the voice is, yeah, you're
Can you
back.
hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
I think it's important to appreciate the fact that India is one of the few countries in the developing world which has a written constitution with fundamental rights enshrined, which have actually been enforced over the period of 70 years since we attained independence. Secondly, India is one of the few countries which has regular elections where the victorious party actually is allowed to assume power. Please appreciate that at the time of independence, and I think it's important to reflect on our journey, as it were, so that after independence, so that we understand where we are today. We are one of the few countries in the developing world and even the developed world. And when I say the developed world in terms of democracy, really it's only Western Europe, North America, Japan, and Australasia where democracy actually functioned for any length of time. Latin America only got out of the military oligarchy in the late 70s and 80s. Eastern Europe, though it has got out of the so-called communist system, there is no real democracy to talk of. The whole of Asia, apart from India, you can see what is happening. There's hardly any democratic, liberal democratic constitutional regime which is guaranteed by a written constitution. So India is in that sense very, very unique. I think it's very important to understand that in India, the written constitution guarantees fundamental rights. It actually guarantees the separation of powers. So therefore, parliament or legislators make laws, the executive implements them, and the judiciary is supposed to judicially review the actions of parliament as well as that of the executive. Unlike the UK, where parliament is supreme, in India, we actually have judicial review not only of statutes but also of the constitution. So the court in India, in terms of actual power, is very, very, and perhaps the most powerful court in the world. That is the Supreme Court and all the superior courts, which are the high courts of the states. Now, let me try to illustrate that. If Parliament in England passes a law depriving, as it happened to me, by the way, I was from Kenya, I was a British citizen, and I left England, and they deprived me of my citizenship, and I became an overseas citizen. the English courts couldn't do anything about it. It's only when the European Convention of Human Rights came that the European court struck it down through the what is called the margin of appreciation. But the English court could not do that in their traditional system. It's only when the European Convention came. But in India, from 1950s, our courts can strike down laws if they violate fundamental rights or they do not have the legislative competence to enact those laws, or if they actually alter the basic structure. So we have that position entrenched in our constitution. But has it failed? So it's important for the audience to understand that we have failed over a period of time to preserve these institutions which are supposed to oversee the legislatures as well as the executive. Now, before I go into the failures, let me also add that it's not only the judiciary, which is an institution, which is to the balancing act between the executive, parliament, and the judiciary. There are a whole host of institutions, including, for example, since we are just uh, passed through elections, the Election Commission of India, which has to ensure free elections, the press, the mainstream press, the all the social media. That's a very important institution. Educational institutions, institutions of import in terms of research, instead of institutions like statistical surveys, etc. They are very important institutions. They all play a very important role in trying to preserve democracy because they feed into the government. It's the institutions which actually make sure that proper information goes to the executive and they decide according to the information which is received, and they base their decisions on evidence. So, on all these fronts, we have seen an erosion of the institutions such that traditionally the civil and political rights and economic and social and cultural rights are both compromised. And this has become so vividly apparent and manifest in the COVID, I don't know what to call it, the COVID scenario. Let me use a very neutral word. Of course, I don't think we should use neutral words because there's been a complete absence of governance, which has led to huge number of deaths and preventable deaths. So, both on the civil and political rights, and also of economic, social, and cultural rights, there's been a complete failure of realizing and protecting and observing those rights. So let me first go to the civil and political rights and see how the institutions which are supposed to make sure that there is a balance so the executive doesn't have a field day have not fared according to the expectations of the constitution. Now, in terms of civil and political rights, there have been a large number of laws which have come into place by the present government in the last um, uh, 7 years, which have actually looked at very vital issues and altered the very basic premise of the Indian Constitution. One of the things that we pride on, and let me tell you that, if now you probably realize that in the United States, despite the 14th Amendment, which is 14th Amendment, there was not, unlike India, where Article 14, which is akin to the 14th Amendment, was right there from the start. In the US, they amended it after the Civil War, which was actually one of the major issues was of slavery being abolished. But even after that, black people did not get equal rights and they had to fight for the 14th Amendment and they achieved it. And even then, after that, the southern states did not implement it. For example, there was segregation of schools. And ultimately, the Civil Rights Act came in after Martin Luther King's huge advocacy and protest movements. We had that right from the start in India because we had an unequal society and our framers of the constitution, especially Dr. Ambedkar, felt that we need to make sure that we aspire towards equality and has been written into as a fundamental rights which is not derogable at all. And we have provided for affirmative action, as is known as the US, to make sure that those who have been historically deprived of their rights are actually given some sort of a head start in terms of reservations. But in all that, it is the judiciary which plays the most important part in making sure that these rights are preserved, protected, and furthered and realized. So if you see how Parliament has passed laws, then we see the failure of these institutions. Now, one of the most important indicators of what the constitutional vision is the preamble of the Constitution. The preamble is a very important part of our Constitution. And if I may, I can just um, point out what it talks about, and it'll give you an idea, and I'll illustrate that in terms of, say, religion. Unlike other countries, religions are treated equally in India. In England, for example, only the king can be only Protestant, or in other countries, they have to be a Catholic, etc., etc., even in the US. But in India, you cannot favor one religion over the other. And this is a very, very important part. We have plurality of religion, of ethnicity, of cultures, of languages, of course, very importantly, in terms of dress, culture, everything. There is plurality in terms of all these things, and that is one of the most important parts of our constitution, to see that plurality is actually being observed. Now, the preamble actually talks of, in a very simple way, what is the vision of the constitution. And let me read it out. We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, and this is an amendment, socialist, secular, democratic republic. This is an amendment part, and to secure to all citizens. This is very important. Justice, social, economic, and political, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, equality of status and opportunity, and to promote fraternity, assuring dignity of the individual and the unity and the integrity of the nation. In our Constituent Assembly, this 26th day of November 1949, do hereby adopt, enact, and give ourselves this Constitution. So it's the people giving the Constitution to itself. Justice, liberty, equality are the actual underlying underpinnings of our Constitution. Those are those very things that are being denuded. So the Citizenship Amendment Act, for example, actually allows only certain religions also to come into India, and except for Muslims, all others are protected. So there is a clear discrimination against Muslims. These issues have been brought up in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has refused to actually take them up, avoiding their responsibility. The Jammu and Kashmir Assembly has a separate autonomous status by virtue of Article 370. That was abrogated by Parliament on a specious ground, which I'm not getting into. All that was challenged. The Supreme Court has not heard it for now nearly 1.5 years. There are several other things like that where the Supreme Court doesn't want to hear matters because maybe the government of India would find it inconvenient. Take another example. The government introduced electoral bonds where anybody can actually donate money to a political party. The original idea was that it should be fair and transparent. But lo and behold, money is given into I can go and buy an electoral bond through a bank, and then I can give it to a political party. It has been challenged on grounds, among others, that it is not transparent. Supreme Court has not heard it. And lo and behold, you can expect, and we know now, that vast amounts of money in the electoral bonds are given to the ruling party. But who's giving it, we never know. So these issues have not been taken up by the Supreme Court. There have been several instances of denudation of an infringement of free speech. In some courts, there hasn't been any respite on the infringement. Now, recently, I think this week itself, one of our colleagues actually challenged the sedition law, which was actually imported from the British law. The British actually gave it up. We continued it. The Supreme Court, in a particular case, said it can only be used when speech actually leads to violence immediately. That has been challenged, but I don't know when the challenge will be taken up. So, though there are infringements of free speech, etc., they are not being taken up. So the judiciary has been abdicating its responsibility. They say when the government is strong, and the government is very strong, not only because of the mandate, but how it operates, the judiciary becomes weak. That's been our history, and that's what we are witnessing now. The police has been overactive in a number of states. If you say anything against the government, they actually book you for an offense, mostly under sedition or disrupting communal harmony under the Indian Penal Code. And even though you may be acquitted, at the end of it, the process itself is a punishment. The courts have not been able to bring any succor to those people. So that is as far as civil and political rights are concerned. Now, that is also as far as the judiciary is concerned. But we have a more serious problem. All other institutions, particularly the media, which is supposed to be a very important part of the balancing of institutional frameworks in a liberal, democratic, constitutionally governed society, have completely failed. And the media has become a mouthpiece of the government. Not only that, they in fact actually lead the charge against dissidents and urge the government to take on the dissidents and call them anti-nationals. If anything is said against the government, more likely than not, one is going to be labeled as an anti-national. So there you have it. And there, not only the media has completely failed, but also the judiciary has failed. Now, in fact, in the recent COVID crisis, a number of articles have appeared, and one of the editors of the mainstream newspaper of the New Indian Express actually mentioned this, that all institutions have failed, including his institution, which is the mainstream media. And because of that, today we have an over-centralized government where not more than two people are making decisions. Scientific advisors, medical experts have no role to play. Because we have adopted what is known as the British style of government, not a presidential system, where the cabinet of ministers actually take decisions. We have a situation where the cabinet form of government has literally been replaced by a presidential form of the government. As a result, it appears from the articles and also otherwise manifest that very few people take decisions, and they are limited to the top two of the leadership of the ruling party, and even ministers don't have much of a say in that. For example, in the COVID crisis, it's not the health minister who's in charge, it's the prime minister and the home minister. So because of over-centralization, lack of advice from scientific and medical experts, we have landed ourselves in a situation where decisions are being taken, they horse medical and scientific advice. So in terms of economic, social, and cultural rights, again, there's been such a lot of infringement that we are in a complete mess today. The first COVID wave took us not by very great surprise, but we were lucky. It didn't affect us very much. And we had leadership of the government talking of exceptional Indians. And they touted the notion that we had actually conquered the COVID-19 crisis. despite expert advice that we should actually prepare for the second wave, which was manifestly hitting Europe and North America with muted variants of COVID 19, we completely dropped our guard, and the leadership did not set an example of maintaining that guard, whether it was in terms of setting up infrastructure to make sure oxygen uh, generating equipment is available to all districts. The advice was given, and it was only followed by a few states, among them Kerala and Chhattisgarh, which don't have a crisis like that, but not by Delhi, not by a lot of other states. As a result, we find ourselves in a complete mess where people are dying today, left, right, and center, particularly in Delhi, because oxygen generating equipment are leading to large number of preventable deaths. There is absolutely no excuse for such a thing. It is preventable, those deaths are preventable, and the governments are accountable for that. But we have completely failed in being able to protect, respect, and promote the right to health and the right to life. What have the institutions done? Until 3 weeks ago, all the newspaper and the news media were saying the same thing as the leadership of the government. They didn't realize that it's going to hit us hard. All institutions had collapsed. They were not able to check the government. And that's what the news edits are saying now. So I think there also the judiciary has not come up on terms. They have actually taken up the cases, but for the last 7 days, for example, the Delhi High Court has been actually looking at the oxygen crisis, but for 7 days, they have not been able to actually get the oxygen to the people who need them. The Supreme Court has taken up the matter. I have filed a couple of petitions in the Supreme Court. But, for example, on the issue of vaccinations and drugs, we have completely failed in the sense that for 70 years, the immunization program, which has been a success in India, and centrally driven programs, which have been a success in India, for immunization, polio and smallpox have been eradicated because the central government procures all the vaccines, distributes them to the states who actually give them to the people free of charge. For the first time after 70 years, the central government, for reasons completely unknown, have decentralized that. They're not going to procure the COVID vaccines when everybody needs them. And they have forced the states to buy them at higher prices than the central government from private companies who are making super profits. And it's anybody's guess whether they will get the vaccines because they have to compete with the private entities, not only in India, but even from abroad. As a result of which, for the first time, after Mrs. Gandhi changed the patent law, and we had the lowest prices of drugs and vaccine all of from compared to any part of the world, we are going to have to pay more than what Europeans, North Americans are paying for vaccines. It's a shocking state of affairs. People's right to equality of access to medical services, facilities, and goods, and to secure and realize their right to health has actually been infringed. So, even on economic, social, and cultural rights, and the obligation, by the way, under international law, under the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenant, ICSSR, and Article 12, which actually mandates the right to health to be realized and protected and fulfilled, requires that all therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines should be made available and accessible. That means affordable. But that's not going to be the case if the government's decision to decentralize them is going to be maintained and if the Supreme Court doesn't interfere. I don't know whether I've taken more of the time. How am I doing for time? Hello.
Ravi, you're on mute. you will have to unmute, Ravi. Please. Yeah.
Winding up,
Yeah.
Anand.
So, yeah, I'm winding up. I think I'm nearly finished. I think the situation is very grim, both in terms of civil and political rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights. I think we are in a serious situation where we should have been self-sufficient, where we had the advantage, which we have actually allowed to be squandered by misgovernance of the government. There's no other word for it. And in the result, human rights have been not only compromised, but have been infringed in such a disastrous manner, directly leading to deaths of hundreds and thousands of people, all of which were preventable. The High Court in Madras actually remarked orally that the Election Commission, in allowing elections to proceed with thousands of people thronging political leaders to hear their speeches, was tantamount to being accessory to murder. Can less be said of the governments? Not only the Electoral Commission. I think the governments are accountable, and whether they would actually be held to account is an open question. I think all of us in India, human rights activists, despite our best efforts, we will have to actually look back at history and see how history will judge ourselves. We are in the throes of a very, very grim situation. Whether we come out of it with our rights intact or not is a question which is not answerable right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anand. And let me also mention that Anand was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to health for many years and did a very excellent job. Now I have the pleasure of inviting Kavita Srivastava, who, as I mentioned to you, is the National General Secretary of the People's Union for Civil Liberties. Kavita, you have the floor.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, friends. Thank you, Ravi, for inviting me. And I'm glad to see my very dear friend Anand also in this meeting, along with other friends whom I don't know, but glad to know that you'll give us the space. Let me actually conclude where Anand should have concluded, but that's for us to share that actually Anand and Indira Jaising, top lawyers of our country, along with the organization, the Lawyers Collective, has been attacked in such a way, and that's part of, where they're trying to put this, instill fear, trying to silence all kind of questioning, because the Lawyers Collective has, from the front foot, taken on decisions of the government which are unconstitutional. And so they have every Indian agency, whether it is the income tax or the ED, the Enforcement Directorate or the CBI, all, investigating them as if they have so much to hide. They've done money laundering. That's some kind of a charge. So it's sad that in this country of ours, we are today at a point where we don't know. We all are, and we all are persecuted. Let me tell you, we all are going through a persecution. All of us have a certain threat to our civil liberties. We don't know who's going to be arrested next, who's going to be raided, whose telephone or computer is going to, have some sort of spyware, enter and make some files, and later they will make out a case that Anand has taken leave from a particular case called the Bhima Koregaon, which I'm also going to talk about. He's arguing one of the matters in that where they use this kind of spyware to generate electronic evidence that to substantiate their point of, how they wanted to, how this group wanted to bring down the Indian government. And initially, they also tried to tell us that they wanted to assassinate the Prime Minister. This particular case, the Bhima Koregaon 16 now. So, so I want to start, as I said, stating that whoever is, it's the Bush's doctrine. If you're not with us, there is no middle ground. You are against us, and you have no right to exist. And how do we silence you? How? I mean, it's so sad that when I'm looking at some of the cases as a human rights worker, I've not come with a prepared speech. I'm in the middle of trying to see whether we can prevent even one or two people's lives in this COVID mismanagement. We've been led to this catastrophe, and the apocalypse may follow. We are seeing people dying in corridors. Doctors are telling us that we are treating the living on the dead. So we wait for somebody to depart so that we can give a oxygen, a ventilator. So I'm in the thick of things. I'm a full-time, on the ground human rights activist. I don't have a script. So Ravi, you can stop me when I finish. But I'd like to just explain the picture of what one's life has become. And that's not just mine. That's the life of most of us, whether we are journalists, whether we are activists, whether we are even people science activists, whether we are educationists. Today, wherever you are located, if you just disagree, you try to teach correct history, even then there may be a case against you, because the present government is one of the fronts of an organization called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. It's going to celebrate 100 years. The fascist organization, perhaps in the world history, which has lived longest, in 2025 is going to be their 100 years. Okay, so we are already in the 96th year. Okay, so for 96 years, they have worked very hard to reach a point to create, to convert a secular and a welfare Indian state into a completely, a Hindu Rashtra. The majority people in India, as all of you would know, belong to the religion which is Hindu. Each one being Hindu in a different way. Well, many of us come under that. 88% of us come under that. I was also born Hindu. I have no connect with what the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the kind of Hindutva, the kind of ideology they're trying to give. I have no connect with that ideology. That is not the way we were brought up. That's not the Hinduism we were taught. So in the agenda of making India a Hindu Rashtra, they have thousands of organizations in every sphere, in every institution. You have an apartment, and there they will have one person of their institution, the apartment pracharak, the apartment publicity agent. If you're in the market, they have their own market councils. If you're in government, they will have their own retired. If there are army men, then the RSS is running so many ex-servicemen's organizations and sending all kinds of materials to them. I live in a border state. We have an 1,100 kilometers border, and we know the kind of filth that is sent again and again. So the ideology of a large section of our Indian society, of a very, very large section of the Indian society, of those who are Hindus, is being militarized. And there seems to be now a consensus. I hate to say it, I mean, these are my observations, that Narendra Modi, the present Prime Minister, has been anointed to perhaps save the Hindu religion, because Islam is a very big threat. The one other religion that has been put as the enemy religion is Islam. Christianity, of course, is also an enemy religion, but it's a little bit behind. So Narendra Modi is there to save us, the Hindus, and we, and not just save us, but a process of the Hindu kingdoms that were, removed, defeated 2,000 years ago. Okay, so the restoration of the Hindu power after 2000, those kinds of myths, mythologies that are constructing people's minds. So in this backdrop, there is a consensus that human rights, we must not talk about human rights. If we have to at all talk about human rights, then we must talk about the human rights of the police. It's what is it that you're talking about? Human rights of tribals, of Dalits. Talk about the human rights of the police. The whole discourse has been sort of put upside down. No more can you have anything which, I mean, all the principles or categories of analysis with which we used to work are now actually hardly in existence, because whenever there's so much whataboutery, so whenever you try to bring a point of view, as Anand said, that not only is our mainstream media become their mouthpieces, but also the social media is totally controlled by them. Just today, 4 hours ago, we were told by very senior professors from West Bengal, telling us that all these various videos have nothing to, Calcutta is not burning. Yes, there was some violence, but these video clips that are being put out by the BJP IT cell, along with some others, are absolutely false. But this will incite violence. So actually, so what am I trying to say? I'm just trying to give you a scenario that things are very grim, and there is not just the consensus. I mean, it's the takeover by the RSS and the militarizing of people's minds by the RSS now has the consensus of a very large population that they're even defending COVID deaths in the crematorium when people are arguing, who may very well, be affiliated to the BJP party, are arguing that this person, my younger brother, should not have gone so early, but there will be somebody in the crematorium arguing back that this was nothing. This is not Narendra Modi's fault. This has nothing to do with misgovernance. It is people who never kept themselves protected. I mean, this catastrophe is being created by people and not the complete collapse of governance. Actually, there is no government. So my first point is that if we are talking of, I mean, human rights, the discourse in human rights and human rights restoration or the proliferation of human rights can only happen in a scenario where there is a consensus for it. There is a consensus. So the consensus came from the people to some extent, and our institutions. Anand has already told us what's happened to the courts. We can't even run to the courts as a human rights activist. That was, I mean, we knew we had to move in a multiple way. We had to go to the people. We had to do street protests. We had to be on social media. We had to make the government accountable through various modes, through multiple modes. And therefore, the courts was a very big ally. The courts have seized to be an ally of, not us. I'm not asking them to be an ally of us, not of us private actors, but of the Constitution. It should try to adhere and at least reinstate the principles and the values of the Constitution, but it's far away from it. Kashmir, Article 370 was removed in 2018. And after that, internet did not go on for years together. I mean, we are in 21. It was only restored in January. 4G internet, which the rest of the country had. And the bifurcation of the state happened. Everything happened in Kashmir, along with the large number of killings and violations. But the case of Kashmir remains in the Supreme Court without any hearing being given to it. The unconstitutional law that Anand talked of, the discriminatory citizenship law, the law which for the first time in this country is going to decide citizenship on the basis of religion, which never existed, has not been heard. And they will probably never hear it. Sedition, well, they've issued notices, but it may also go underground. So all the critical, I don't want to go through the list of critical cases, but what did the courts hurry with? They hurried with the with their business on the Ram Mandir, you know, the temple that they thought was very important. Well, I have given too much of a context. I was supposed to actually focus, which is something I'm working on day and night, are the several draconian laws, but there's one law called the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which till now should have been struck down by the Indian Supreme Court, but it has become the handle to incarcerate people so that they can never come out. And there is no respect for being an activist today, because every activist, according to them, is an anti-national, number one. Number two, an urban Nakshal, supporting Maoists and creating city-based Maoists. Maoists have ceased to be now in the tribal areas or in, far-flung rural areas, the Maoists, but they are now, it's a banned party. The CPI Maoist is a banned party. They disagree with the Indian state completely. So they are in a military situation, but it's an internal situation. And it's something which could have been handled very differently anyway. So we are all urban Nakshals, and we are proliferating, we are creating, we are educating, we are raising awareness to create more and more. Now, the UAPA law is a law in very simple terms. It's a law where you don't get bail, because at the stage of bail, you were never supposed to assess the merit of a case. The bail grounds used to be very different. They were on grounds of whether you would, if you ended up coming out, would you destroy evidence? On the basis of whether, if you came out, would you be a threat to the witnesses, or you would run away? But those grounds are now unimportant. You're supposed to see the merit of the case pre-trial. You're supposed to see the merit of the case without the papers being with the lawyers of the accused. You're supposed to, look at the merit of the case. So nobody ever gets bail. So, and there are these agencies, as I told you earlier, about the agencies that they've put behind activists and lawyers. There is this agency called the National Investigating Agency, NIA, just put on a job of picking out activists and to prepare cases to put on bail. So what we are observing very quickly in the Bhima Koregaon case, the Bhima Koregaon, 16 people have been incarcerated. According to them, the real perpetrators of violence, something happened it was the 200th anniversary of the victory of the Mahar regiment, a Dalit regiment in the British Army that defeated a very, very repressed Peshwa regime. This is like 200 years ago. It happened in 1880. So it was a celebration 200 years later of that victory of the Bhima, which the battle which was fought at Bhima Koregaon. Now, on the run-up to the 2018 200th year celebrations, that's the victory happened on the 1st of January 1818. So on the evening of the 31st of December 2017, a very big meeting happened. A public meeting happened where about 1 lakh people came, and it was people from all over Maharashtra. This was very much in Maharashtra. Bhima Koregaon was near Pune. So this was in Pune. It was in one of the grounds of Pune. And what did they say? They simply critiqued governance. They critiqued what this government was. And it's a statement. They read out a poem and a statement which I would make every day, that this government needs to go like how the Peshwa regime went. And they next day, when the people were going to Bhima Koregaon, the lakhs of people, they were attacked. And the attacks are done by very much the RSS organizations, by 2 RSS organizations. But what happened? The case, everything is upturned. The cases then happen. The affairs against these Hindutva characters is now put in cold storage. They are like free. They can go and do more destruction. But those who were never involved, those who had nothing to do with any of that violence, are now in jail, perhaps never to come out.
Kavita, you need to start winding up.
More than 10 of them are over the age of 60. One is 83, one is 80. Anand Grover, Indira Jaising and their team worked very hard to get the person out on medical bail, because bail you cannot get very quickly. Going to the PUCL National Secretary Sudha Bharadwaj is also in this. She's a trade union leader. So who do we have arrested? Trade union leaders. We have lawyers, trade union leaders, and some activists arrested because they don't want people to do their job. So you are criminalized. Your act of activism is criminalized and put behind bars. Very quickly, I want to talk about the Delhi, give me 2 minutes, just give me 2-3 minutes to talk about the Delhi anti-CAA, the violence that was perpetrated again by the BJP members. They were the ones who set a certain part of Delhi. They provoked the violence. They set it afire. They had all the ammunition to do that. But at the end, who was arrested? In the name of conspiracy, the Delhi Police Special Cell interrogated 400 activists. I mean, 40 of my friends, about 50 of my friends were also interrogated for hours and hours. And now the conspiracy, who is in the conspiracy? The conspiracy is by all young people, all under 32. Students who are very active in the anti-CAA struggle are all under UAPA. And they have connected them to the death of the 55 people who were killed. So we don't know, they can also give them a death sentence. I fear that, but they're targeting, and these are mostly Muslims who got arrested. So the targeting of activists in the name of Maoism, urban Nakshals, the targeting of Muslims in the name of terror and ISI and the use of UAPA has become so everyday. I cannot take you on the journey of all over India that PUCL is undertaking. So I would end what I have to say, that these are conversations that take long. They take longer. These are conversations that need to be understood, because I really don't know who I'm talking to. I don't understand the framework. I'm presuming everybody is connected to India and would understand the framework. But I think this is a global question. If the coronavirus spreads the way it is, it's a global threat. If civil liberties is lost in India of activists, then remember, all of the media, so many journalists have been arrested, or we are going to completely lose all institutions. That it's for the world to understand what we are becoming. And these conversations must be with some more understanding, time. Our frameworks and structures need to be different. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity and also taking out the time to understand our grievance, our the manner in which we are living in India. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kavita, very much. I'll now, without further ado, call on Professor Balcerowicz.
Thank you
Professor
so
Balcerowicz, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for inviting me to the panel. I feel truly privileged to be a part of this discussion. I would like to focus on a few aspects. First of all, if we recall a certain period of time, not so long ago, perhaps 15 years ago, there was Manmohan Singh as the Prime Minister of India, a Sikh by religion. There was Abdul Kalam, a Tamil Muslim, as the President of India. And at the same time, Somnath Chatterjee, the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, pretty detached from religion, not to say an atheist. It was 15 years ago. Remarkably, India has changed within the last 15 years. Could we imagine a similar setup of the three most important political positions in India? In India, which is supposed to be by majority Hindu, but India at the time, as we recall, had a Muslim president, had an religious Lok Sabha parliament speaker, and Sikh as the prime minister. We are talking about human rights in India, and I would primarily focus on the abuse of human rights in India. I would argue that the situation of human rights in India is mostly of abusive character, and this abuse is systemic and systematic. When I say it is systemic, I mean that it is embedded in the political and legal structure of India. It is not a coincidence that human rights violations happen in India. It is a part of the political program now, and it has always been a part of the political setup in India. When I say it is systematic, I mean that violations in India, violations of human rights in India have been taking place regularly, permanently, and the situation has been deteriorating over years. India, as the state, has done little, if anything, to curb, to stop the increasing level of human rights violations. We see the different parts of what I call the apparatus of state violence, that is the police, the army, but also the system of administration in India has been acting with impunity against the interests of people. And the abuse of human rights has been happening with tacit acquiescence and in fact even with encouragement from different political groups in India. When we analyze, now let's focus on the systemic part of human rights violations. I'm not going to talk about how much the situation in India has deteriorated. I want to highlight some systemic legal aspects of this. India is a part of a number of human rights treaties. In fact, the international regime for human rights has at least 18 basic laws. India has accepted only 8 of these. That is, has not accepted even half of them. This is surprising if we deal with a country which claims to be the largest democracy in the world. It is not. Conspicuously, the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment has not been ratified by India. India signed it in 1997, but has never ratified it. It is not in force. Similarly, India has not ratified another important convention, International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. These two conventions against torture and enforced disappearance and killing are extremely vital in political culture of India, because the victims of human rights violations perpetrated by Indian apparatus of state violence has been suffering primarily in political terms from these two aspects, torture and enforced disappearances. We have cases in Kashmir, we have mass graves in Kashmir, but not only there. Let us think simply of the so-called red belt or red zone of the Naxalites, which runs through Bihar, Jharkhand, Deccan up to the south. We have in numerous cases of such enforced disappearances, in fact, of a number of human rights violations, which I call the four-pack of abuses: enforced disappearances, illegal detentions, torture, and extrajudicial killings. Every Kashmiri knows what it means. Many tribal residents of the areas in Odisha or in Jharkhand know it from their own personal experience, that their friends, relatives simply disappear. They are subject to torture or extrajudicial killing. This is something unacceptable in any country which claims to be a democracy. Surprisingly, the arch rival of India, Pakistan, has a ratified convention against torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. India has not. The problem, as I say, is systemic. Of course, it is vital for any democracy to have a clear separation of power. But India has not the separation of power, or does not enjoy this separation of powers in a clear way. It is no longer a defective democracy. Of course, this has been finally acknowledged in different rankings, like India's performance in freedom in the world ranking. India is no longer free. It is partly free. It is in the same category as Pakistan. This has happened in the last few years. Democracy Index also classifies India as a flawed democracy. To hold elections from time to time does not make a state a democracy. In the Soviet Union, elections took place, but nobody would claim it was a democratic country. So to have elections is just one part of a true democracy. Human rights are a cornerstone for any functioning democracy. The problem with the system in India is what I would call the blend of three aspects: the blend of the military, of politics, and religion. Let's take as an example Jammu and Kashmir, unconstitutionally dissolved in August 2019. All the governors of Jammu and Kashmir have been related to the army. Krishna Rao, governor of Jammu and Kashmir, he was a direct participant of the first India-Pakistani war over Jammu and Kashmir. He was a commander of a battalion there. Girish Chandra Saxena, the next governor, he was a director of the research and analysis wing. He was deeply involved in also in the military. Lieutenant General Srinivas Kumar Singh, the next governor, he was a vice chief of the army staff, director of military intelligence, just like Chandra Saxena was related to intelligence. Narendra Nath Vora, again a governor of Jammu and Kashmir, he served in the army as Union Defense Production Secretary, then he was Union Defense Secretary. India has a serious problem. A politician, well, an army officer general can become a politician. This is not acceptable in a proper functioning democracy. We find lots of examples of this nexus between the military and politics. In fact, we can speak in that we find in India a sort of deep state, perhaps not as deep as in the case of Pakistan, but we have dozens, if not hundreds of names of ex-generals or army officers who became politicians or diplomats. General Jayantanath Chowdhury, Gopal Gurunath Bivor, Shankar Roy Chowdhury, Vijay Kumar Singh, Muhammad Ayub Khan, Prakash Malhotra, Joginder Jaswant Singh, Sunit Francis Rodriguez, Venkata Krishna Rao, Jayavardhan Singh Rathore, Jaswant Singh. These are all ex-army officers, ex-generals, and we know these names as active politicians. Jaswant Singh, a retired officer of the Indian Army. He was a founding member of BJP. He was a BJP parliament member, then a minister of finance, external affairs and defense. Why is it important? India has a systemic structure which brings the military thinking into politics, which brings the methods, military methods to solve conflicts and problems into politics. The military normally does not solve problems. I would rather say personally, it makes more problems than it solves. In any case, if we have a conflict, we need other solutions than military ones. The structure of politics in India facilitates this transfer of military know-how in dealing with conflict solutions into politics. And this has a direct impact on the way how politicians in India understand the situation of human rights, how they understand the situation of minorities, of victimized groups. These are treated primarily as targets which should be annihilated. This is precisely the strategy which usually the army has. This is one, as you see, we have one serious problem. The other problem is the saffronization of Indian politics and Indian armed forces. Again, I would give you countless examples of Indian officers who are closely linked to Hindutva ideology, who treat army and armed forces as an extension of Hindutva ideology. They act as an extension of politics. This is a very serious problem in India in general. We all know the problem with the saffronization of Indian politics. The example with which I started, that India once had a time when a Muslim was the president, an atheist or semi-religious person was locked up, was the parliament speaker, Lok Sabha speaker, and prime minister who was Sikh, so none of the top politicians was a Hindu, is simply unimaginable in India now. This has happened within 15 years. The process started much, much earlier. I do not want to blame everything on the elites related to Hindutva. The Congress Party and other parties are to blame for this situation. Why would Indian Army be interested? When we see the budget, you can go to the data of the World Bank. We see that military expenditure in India has risen exponentially in recent years. It has been permanently increasing. This explains partly that the army is also interested in this setup, political setup in India. This forms a background for human rights violations in India. We have a lot of legislation in India which has grown out of the military mindset. I will mention just a few of such legal acts. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act We know it very well from Manipur, Nagaland, Assam, and Jammu and Kashmir. Of course, it was an extension of the British Armed Forces Special Powers Ordinance of 1948 to deal with Indian opposition and Quit India movement. But India has accepted this legislation, and this legislation is still operative. The Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, original such legislation, the Jammu and Kashmir Public Safety Act, further, the Preventive Detention Act, the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, the Disturbed Areas Act, all these legal measures exist in violation of Indian constitution, in violation of basic human rights, in violation of international law, human rights law, India is part of. The effect is, for instance, collective punishment, arrests, preventive custody for up to 2 years without trial or bail. These regulations allow state actors to act with impunity against the population of India, like in Jharkhand, Odisha, in Jammu and Kashmir. These acts, these legal regulations allow the army to act with impunity and in an irresponsible manner. None of the perpetrators of violence and human rights violations will ever face courts. This is a serious problem. So this is what I mean by systemic abuse of human rights in India. It is not simply that some persons act irresponsibly. It is the legal structure of the law in India, which is both against the international obligations of India, but it is also in violation of Indian constitution. Not to mention the abolition of Act 370 of the abolition of Kashmiri autonomy, which was unconstitutional too. Surprisingly, the Supreme Court has not taken any action against this. This is suspended, even though for actually most legal specialists, this was an unconstitutional act. Jammu and Kashmir is only just one part where we face the gravity of human rights violations. I mentioned this red corridor, or as others call it, the compact revolutionary zone, which goes from Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, Jharkhand, and the areas of the Dandaka Aranya, the term from the Mahabharata, the ancient name, which comprises Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Telangana, and Andhra Pradesh, and up to Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, and down to Karnataka. It's a vast area of India, which comprises more than 100 districts, where people find more protection from Naxalites than from the government of India. Another problem which shows the systemic nature of human rights violations is a nexus between the oligarchs in India, large companies, and politicians. Home Minister and previous Minister of Finance, Chidambaram, was an excellent example. It was much before BJP era. It was the time of the Congress era, between 2004 up to 14, where we could see a number of legislations which allowed large companies to extract bauxite and other resources with violation of basic rights of the indigenous communities, in tribal areas. There was no legal protection for these communities, and these cases will demonstrate how politicians, top politicians, finance minister, home minister, who are involved in drafting legislation which benefited large companies against the interests of minorities. When we think of human rights, we should not forget women's rights. This is another shame in India. There is no proper legislation which would provide proper protection for women against family violence, against rape, abuse at various stages. This starts with many elements of culture, dowry system. Several years ago, MPs were asked whether as we know, dowry is not legal in India. But a survey was conducted and almost every MP was asked 15 years ago, more or less, whether any one of them ever had stuck to this prohibition of dowry. In other words, whether they never gave dowry to their daughters, with their daughters. None of them ever admitted that, all of them admitted that they paid the dowry, in violation of the laws they make themselves. This is a paradox. We see MPs in India, which on the one hand say dowry should not be legal. On the other hand, 100% of them violates this law. The result of this law is the treatment of women as a commodity which can be paid for, or which carries the money with her, which can be raped, can be killed if she does not fulfill her obligations expected of her at home. There is no proper law and no protection, even if there were. Of course, there are some laws, but these laws are not implemented properly. The police do not investigate the cases properly. The criminals do not face proper justice. I think I should wind up. So just to recapitulate, I would claim that the level of abuse in India of human rights has increased. The situation of democracy in India has deteriorated, and the result is that the general deterioration of the situation of human rights in India. Thank you.
Ravi, you are muted.
Thank you. Thank you. The organizers have signaled to me that the next panel needs to take over in a few minutes. There are a few questions which I saw in the chat box. I will speak to the organizers and see how we can handle them at a future point. I thank you all for your patience and your time. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank you as well, Ravi, for moderating this panel. And we would love to have a question answer session again with the speakers at another point of time. But today, because we were running back-to-back panels, so it would have to wind up now. I'm so sorry for that. And Kavita, we just absolutely loved your intervention today. It was really necessary. And so was yours, Piotr and Anand. And please, Ravi, let's coordinate on this to have another session on just Q&A and a conversation style session, if that is possible within the week at some point.
Yeah, I was about to point out on 8th of May, we have quite some time. So if Ravi can coordinate, it's possible. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for all your patience and the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.